own state government leadership. We'll start off by introducing our panelists, then we'll cover some of the background behind these meetings, discuss some of the key points we've discovered, and then move on to your questions. So now the introductions. We have Sarah Pfatteicher, the Five College Executive Director. We have Massachusetts State Senator Joe Comerford, representing the district that is home to all of the 5 college campuses and Greenfield Community College. Senator Comerford is Vice Chair of the Joint Committee on Higher Education. We have Massachusetts State Representative Mindy Domb, representing the district that includes 3 of the 5 college campuses. Representative Domb is a member of the Joint Committee on Higher Education. We have Sam Masinter, Smith College Interim Vice President for Public Affairs. And we have Regina Curtis, Greenfield Community College Executive Director of Resource Development. Now I'm going to hand things off to Sarah to cover some of the background.
Great, thank you, Kevin, and thanks everybody for joining us today. So we, prior to a year or so ago, 5 Colleges Incorporated did not really maintain a regular and formal interaction with state or local government officials. We would reach out in a time of need. So if the governor threatened to cut funding to bus transportation in the area, we might have made a phone call, but we didn't have a standing relationship. And only one of our 5 campuses actually has a full-time legislative liaison on staff. So it was also not the case that any of the campuses really had ongoing and regular communication with their delegations. So a few turning points. One is I joined the consortium about 2.5 years ago. And one of the first things I had heard was that the consortium leaders really wanted the consortium first and foremost to be about building community. And it seemed to me that doing that required that we think about the community outside of our campus doors, as well as just on campus. But more importantly, Rep. Domb reached out to us shortly after she was elected and indicated an interest in getting to know more about what we do. And so that certainly started the conversation. And then Senator Comerford and Representative Aaron Vega, who's also from the area, had hosted a sort of a semi-public session with local nonprofit leaders about engagement with local representatives. And that really inspired Kevin and I to want to do some more work intentionally building these relationships. So we set our first gathering of the campuses and 2 of the community colleges in our area with the legislative delegation before the pandemic started. And we thought it would be maybe a once or twice a year kind of an event. As it has turned out, we've had 10 meetings in the last 8 months. I, for one, have found them enormously useful. And I think other folks on the calls, given what the attendance looks like, I think other folks have found them useful too. We've regularly had 6 state representatives show up, a senator, a local mayor who serves on the governor's commission on reopening the economy, and 1 or more representatives from each of the campuses, 7 campuses in all that have participated. So I think it's been a really successful relationship we've built in a time of crisis, and looking forward to sharing with folks today a bit about what we've learned. So Kevin, do you want me to do the?
Sure. If you want to read them, and I can feed you questions that folks want to share with us from the participants.
Excellent. So we thought,
I'm sorry, there's an emergency in my house. I'll be right.
You go. This is part of our lives these days. We step away when we need to step away. So let me begin with a question for our 2 legislators on the call. First, what is the value to your work in sort of normal times for regular communications with campuses in your districts? So Senator Comerford, do you want to start?
Absolutely. And please first let me thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Kevin, and 5 Colleges for convening us here, and of course, for all of the convening you've done during this crisis. I'm delighted to know that the program that actually was hosted by the Community Foundation, so props to the Community Foundation, to Katie Zobel and to Jim for conceiving of a program that would help nonprofits and educational institutions understand their power vis-a-vis state government and their role, frankly, in holding us accountable. So it was both. And So I'm delighted to hear that that was part of this calculus. And of course, the Rock and Mindy Domb, who I get to work with, was part of this. Big love to Mindy for her ever reaching mind in terms of connecting us all up. The 5 colleges for me, and of course, Greenfield Community College, which I'm so proud to represent, they represent both my constituents to whom I'm responsible. They are economic and thought drivers in the region, right? So we need a vibrant knowledge economy here in Western Massachusetts. It's one of the major foundations of how we actually develop our regional economy. These institutions, these 5 institutions in GCC, help lead thought that affects the entire Commonwealth. And frankly, the people power that's actually embedded in these institutions can change government, can both inspire me to file legislation, to fight for legislation that I co-sponsor, to hold me accountable, to fight for higher education, both private and public, and to move us in the direction of regional equity. Out here in Western Massachusetts, we talk a lot about regional equity. In fact, Rep. Domb and I are on a text thread currently where we're talking about regional equity in terms of a rebound from this crisis, both the pandemic and the economic crisis. And one of the centerpieces of that foundation, of that recovery, will be a robust, healthy, engaged higher education sector, public and private. And so you were, and I know we're going to get to this, how you were important before the pandemic, but now in the pandemic, in the economic crisis, you are my constituents, you hold me accountable, I work for you, I serve you, and you are the foundation both of economic well-being and thought development.
Thank you. Rep. Domb, anything you want to add?
Well, I echo everything my partner, Senator Comerford, has said. I also want to say that the institutions of higher education in my district, since I represent Amherst, Massachusetts, so I have 2 colleges and UMass Amherst, are significant stakeholders in our community. They are the major employers of my constituents. I often think that they do 2 things in the Commonwealth, all higher ed does. They provide a service in terms of education and research and knowledge creation, but they also employ people, the nuts and bolts. I used to live in Pittsfield for 10 years, and the biggest employer was General Electric, who left town with a polluted Housatonic River. So I'm very aware that the main factory in town is actually a knowledge-based, education-based factory, but it's still a major employer. And so part of why I reached out to Kevin after I got elected, and we also spoke when I was campaigning, was to understand better what the needs were of these institutions so that I could be better informed in my own advocacy. And I would also know then who to reach out to if either ideas emerged or programs emerged, who I could connect with. I can't imagine actually a better partner than 5 College Inc. as a portal to the 5 college area and the community colleges in the area, because you're both so good at connecting and facilitating. I just want to point that out. So the value in the normal time in terms of a non-pandemic is that it's important to connect with your legislators so that they know what your needs are and that they know that you're a valuable constituency and they represent you, and to be able to identify what your needs are. And it doesn't have to be, here's my needs from the state. It could just be, here are my needs, because we have ears in lots of places. So we may be able to connect you, for example, with your regional transit authority, which the state funds. So it's like an indirect connection, but it's not necessarily something that I would go into the State House with. So you never know where those connections come in any of our work. And I think that's true with legislators, and legislators step in a lot of worlds. So you don't know, and we don't know how we can be of help until we hear what your needs are. I also want to say, I think it's important to have a benchmark relationship. And I know that's a little hard to do right now because of the pandemic, but I think it's important when there's not a pandemic to be also connecting to your legislators, not just because you have needs, but because you want to inform, because that informing makes us better at our jobs. You're doing us a favor. And even if you don't get that feeling from your legislator, you should know that you are making them a better legislator, because the information you're providing them is information that they'll carry into their different worlds that they step in. And not only, I want to say, you're not only an employer in our district, you're not only providing a community resources and endlessly providing community resources, but I also want to point out you're a user of community services. And that's another reason why legislators need to hear from you. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rep. Domb. And I am aware that not all legislators across the country are as supportive as you all have been of higher education and the role that we have in the local economy. So that partnership, I do not take for granted at all. I have seen it look very different than what we're blessed to have here in Western Mass. Can you both talk a little bit about how that has changed, how things have changed since the pandemic? What new questions or issues have emerged that make it beneficial that we're in regular communication with each other? And Rep. Domb, maybe I'll start with you this time.
I think that this is such an interesting question, Sarah, because it's, in a lot of ways, it's the same as before the pandemic. It's just now all those needs are pandemic driven, right? But I think in addition to that, the host community, the relationship between the host communities and the institutions now have a public health dimension that isn't necessarily there during healthy times when we're not dealing with a crisis. I mean, I think it can happen if there's like a meningitis outbreak on a campus that kind of raises that kind of issue, or German measles. This is a little bit different though, right? Because it's a pandemic. It strikes people of all ages. We're really working to trying to contain it with human behavior, because we don't have a vaccine, we don't have medicine, despite what we may be told by the occupant in the White House. So it's a little bit different. But I think that the surrounding that relationship between a host community and institution is probably even more important in the pandemic, and potentially more complicated and sometimes more problematic. And I think one way the role of the elected official can change in that way is to be the bridge between both constituencies, and maybe push each constituency a little further than they're willing to go to be partners with each other. I also think that, and I think Senator Comerford and I have done this together, so I'm interested in hearing what she has to say on this, but there's, as I am with all things that she thinks about, actually, as I say that, I don't want to just limit it to this topic, it's every topic. But I also think there's a bigger need on the part of host communities to have information from their educational community members, bigger than usual. How many students are coming on campus? What are you doing to protect us? What are you doing to protect them? What do you, even colleges that are trying to create bubbles, there is no bubble. I understand that's an aspirational goal and that's sort of an approach to public health, but it doesn't exist because faculty, staff, they live in our communities, even if students are not coming into the community. So I think the need for disclosure of information and transparency is greater. And that may also put more responsibilities on the public officials to make sure that communities have access to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I certainly know in times of crisis, we have this tendency to look inside and take care of ourselves and think about our own institutions or families or organizations. And I think it's been a useful reminder that, our campuses don't exist in isolation. They really are part of communities and have effects on those communities. So to be sort of held to account and reminded that there are a lot of people outside our walls who care how many students are coming back and what safety steps we're taking, I think is really useful. Senator Comerford, anything you want to add about the urgency of our conversations in the last 8 or 9 months?
Thank you. And I really appreciate what Rep. Domb said about all of the stuff that we talked about initially, like the people power that come from the campuses, the intellectual power that come from the campuses, the economic driving aspect of the campuses, that stayed all the way through COVID, but layered into that was, the public health imperative of greater communication, the need for transparency, frankly, from all of us, both the state and all campuses so that we could understand how we together were part of the solution, or part of the way that we're addressing the pandemic. So I completely agree with Rep. Domb there. I would just add that, and this is actually rather poignant, but I felt like getting a visibility or greater visibility into the campuses and what the campuses were struggling with in terms of budgetary stresses, the way the campuses were, expanding their own budgets to try to serve as well as educate, serve the wider community as well as educate, getting a sense of the stressors with regard to students and faculty and staff. It actually made me and my team want to develop more pointed, and I did this with Rep. Domb, more pointed constituent service outreach to communities, so that we made sure, as we were thinking about the kind of state services that are available in emergencies like this, that we wanted to have them available to cohorts in the higher education community that might be experiencing duress, whether it's graduate students at the University of Massachusetts or folks who are furloughed in a campus experiencing economic stressors, or students trying to figure out how the heck they're going to get home. All of these constituents, approached us and Rep. Domb, and I'm sure our colleagues, but having a greater window into what the campuses were doing helped me understand what, when we might see a wave, or when we might understand where to be useful. So I guess I would just say it helped me be more of a useful public servant on behalf of the campuses to understand what the campuses were going through. And then we have been passing layers and layers and layers of policy all throughout this. And, having a constituency like students, faculty, staff, campuses, host communities, as part of my own lens that I look through, was exceedingly helpful. And you made those visible to me in, very consistent, very thorough ways. So, anything that I'm looking at, and whether it's a budget line item or a piece of policy, I'm never able to, and nor would I imagine I would ever want to, but I'm never able to look away, because it's always very present to me. The fact that these are 5 colleges and GCC, they're my responsibility in terms of the broad sense of them. And I have to keep them in mind as a core constituency.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Senator Comerford. And, part of what you mentioned there, the value of hearing really what the campuses are wrestling with, I think points to how important a trusting relationship is, right? That the campuses have been willing to be pretty open about the challenges, the difficulties, the really tough dilemmas that they've faced over the last few months. So let me turn to the campuses. And our first question has to do with what value you've seen from the campus side in having this relationship, because it has really meant bearing your souls in some important ways. And so why has that been a worthwhile thing to do? And Sam, let me start with you from Smith College.
Sure, and I apologize for my dramatic exit earlier. There was a small fire in the kitchen. It's now out. I think that what we've heard a lot around transparency has really been the core of all of this for us. Thinking back over my career, I think government relations writ large at higher education has often been in this kind of either adversarial or transactional role as it's approached when like when I was interviewing for the position and they would talk about what government relations meant. It often was, it's going to be around taxation issues or, concerns about how you're using certain resources in the community. It was never approached as there's this incredible resource and connection you're going to be able to build. And it really is a relationship management piece. I think for us, it has been a realization, especially in a pandemic or any crisis, that there is a need for transparency that we need partners in. We can't just rely on our social media and the press to help us get information out. We need to build these relationships over the long term and look at them really as two-way relationships. And the other thing that I heard mentioned today about connections that we don't know the others have is incredibly important. There were so many problems we faced during the pandemic that in other meetings, people would say, well, it sits deep within the government bureaucracy. We have no way to change it. We're going to have to plan around it. We'd say, actually, we have this standing meeting. We have the exact people who can help us get to the center of that. Around questions around, did this legislation ever consider, and I'll just pull an example out, around the quarantine issues that Massachusetts put in place. How are those going to interface with parents dropping their children off on campus? And it turns out that was a conversation that was being had, but it didn't have enough detail in it, and we could provide some guidance around it, not to lobby for a certain outcome, but to make sure that that was part of the calculus of the decision making. So I think that was a real highlight of, it's not just transactional, it is this, we need each other to make each other's jobs easier and to move it out of this idea that higher ed exists within this kind of ideological bubble that doesn't interact with the community and its surrounding or pieces like that. So I couldn't be happier with these relationships. And I hope, like most things in a pandemic, we don't waste the lessons we learned in a crisis, and we don't go back to, the old ways, that we keep these.
Great, thank you, Sam. And Regina, you and Greenfield Community College have certainly, you're a neighbor institution. You're one of the primary feeders of transfer students to some of our institutions. So we've certainly had a relationship there, but GCC is not a normal attendee in Five College meetings. And so can you talk a little bit about what it was like for GCC to join this broader conversation, not only with the legislative delegation, but also with a number of other institutions?
Absolutely. I have to, in my head, I changed it to the 6 colleges now. Because we're at the table. And being invited to the table was really, really meaningful and timely, particularly around it was because of the pandemic, but I very much understood the value of the concept of these meetings. My background I used to work as a legislative aide to a state representative and attended meetings regularly representing my representative at human service social agency organizations. And I continued my membership to those when I started working at Greenfield Community College 15 years ago, because I recognized the importance and the significance of just being able to talk to each other when we were all in this together feeling, and then having that monthly venue, not only talk to each other, but to know that our delegation was tuned into it. I used to attend those representing, as an aide, and other aides now come, and you cannot overstate the importance of just that ongoing, casual yet very deep relationship. Because I think it was Rep. Domb who said, if you only call once every 3 years when you're in a crisis or a panic, and you're introducing yourself at the same time your hair's on fire or your kitchen, then it's a very different relationship than somebody you have an ongoing monthly relationship and you have a human contact. And so you don't call when your hair's on fire, you call when you're starting to feel the heat. And the example Sam just gave with the quarantine is a really good example of that. It was also extremely helpful to me and to my institution to be at these meetings. And at the beginning of the pandemic, and after each meeting, I would summarize it and meet with our leadership team and just talk about how other colleges were handling issues as they came up. And I got so much feedback about how helpful that was. And we're not a residential institution, so it didn't seem necessarily that it was a linear, level playing field, and it certainly isn't in that regard. But we were all brand new to a pandemic, and having some concept of how other institutions either are like size but differently set up, differently organized, or our flagship university. It was just incredibly helpful in that regard. And I really hope, as we said at the beginning, that we can continue this in a way that we do, that I've always continued with our human service and social service organizations, because that concept is really, really helpful. And there's no doubt that having connections equals communications, and communications equals connections. And those are the two most important things that are getting us all through this moment, but also just get us through our lives. And one quick point, pre-pandemic, but understanding the relationship and the logistics of legislative work, in my years at Greenfield Community College, I have directed so many of our students and even my colleagues to our delegation for constituent matters, which they never would have considered that was even an option. You know, I would hear about an issue or a problem or a significant challenge that somebody was facing, and it would never occur to them if I said, you know, you can call your state senator, or you can call your state representative. And they have this, I know they do, because I used to have it. They have a list of every legislative liaison for every state agency, and they can call these people. And I feel like our gathering together around the pandemic is that writ large, where we all are constituents, and you are responding to that, the two of you and the rest of our delegation, in a way that has been so comforting and so helpful. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Regina. So this has been all lovely, warm and fuzzy. We're all getting along great. I have a couple of harder questions that have come in through the Q&A. So I'm going to take them in reverse order, actually. So one of them has to do about with the boundary between just relationships and information sharing versus lobbying. The question says, clearly a robust conversation between post-secondary institutions, local consortia, and government is important and valuable. Are there boundary lines between valuable conversation, advocacy, and lobbying that may be prohibited in the case of nonprofit, either institutions of higher education or nonprofit consortia? So can any of you want to jump in to talk first about how you think about those boundary lines and what things we should not be talking about when we get together in these groups?
I'll jump in first.
Go for it.
I think that's actually what you shouldn't be talking about is probably a matter for the institution to consult with their lawyer on, to be honest with you. Because when I was in the nonprofit world, the line for me would be partisan politics, but the needs of my organization and the needs of the people my organization served and the needs of my mission, since that is a public mission, your nonprofits, all that's on the table, because I don't look at that as lobbying. I look at that as advocacy, and what my colleagues in the panel have been describing. I like the way that Sam talked about how it's all part of the calculus of our decision-making, and that means you're providing a service to the elected official. But the line that exists for nonprofit, people who work in nonprofit organizations, that has to be something the organization sets for you, I think. It's not something that we would set. Where I would set limits is in receiving financial gifts or gifts of any kind. But in terms of information, that is a gift, but it's not considered one for the finance reform piece. But for me, it's, you know, I don't accept any gifts of money of a certain amount of money. And but in terms of information, I think from the elected officials' perspective, all of it should be on the table. So.
I love that.
Go ahead, Senator.
Sorry, Sarah. I love that characterization. I think of it similarly. In no way was anybody telling, we were not talking about our own races. We were not talking about what's happening at the federal level. We didn't discuss ballot questions, which are also off the table for our teams to discuss. We can as individuals, but not our teams, not our offices. But there's a huge range, as Rep. Domb was saying well, of education and advocacy that is well within the purview of nonprofits. I think the same is with Rep. Domb. Our email inboxes are full of testimony from nonprofits that are calling us to recognize either the importance of a particular piece of legislation or the importance of a concept that they're trying to bring home more generally, or the need to fund a certain program that's specific either to their organization or their constituents' organization, and therefore our constituents. So that is a very robust and enlivened place that is away from partisan politics, away from electoral politics, that we live in with great gratitude for the individuals and nonprofits that are coming to us, seeking that kind of inside-outside public elected partnership that makes us better, makes us stronger.
Can I add one other thing? Because Senator Comerford makes a point that really, I was speaking as what you're limited to. What we're limited to and what you should hold us accountable for is we should not be asking you if you're an enrolled voter. We should not be asking you what party you're in. We shouldn't be asking you about your voting history. All we need to know is that you have either a residence or an impact in our district. And that should be enough for the conversation to open. So if people in other parts of the country, I don't think this would happen in Massachusetts, to tell you the truth, but in other parts of the country, if a legislator or a legislative aide says, well, I'd like to make an appointment with you with the rep or with the senator, but we need to know what party you're enrolled in. That's not ethical. And I think that that becomes a conversation. I mean, it might be legal in a particular state, although I doubt it, but that becomes that's a flag for you that the legislator is not acting in your best interest. They're acting in their best personal interest, and that's not official business. That's personal business.
Thank you. Regina, Sam, either one of you want to talk about how you think about the boundaries?
Sure. I think there are clear-cut cases where higher education organizations are going to be engaged in lobbying. I think especially for individual colleges and universities, not at the level of a state institution, small colleges, regional colleges, generally aren't going to have a lobbying presence. We're too small. But we may be members of larger organizations. So for example, there's ACUM, the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities in Massachusetts. ACUM may lobby on behalf of their member institutions broadly, but that doesn't mean that any of our individual colleges are sending people to state houses or trying to meet with senators to influence individual legislation. I think that's very different than the relationships we're talking about here, where I think on each side, the institution and the legislative side, what's necessary is sharing of information. We are not trying to sway things in a particular direction. We are just trying to make sure that our legislators have the information. And if they don't, they can ask us what they need, and we can act on their behalf to gather that and kind of close the information gap between actions and those who those actions are affecting in their community.
Thank you. Yeah, I used to work with a legislative liaison on another campus who said that her sort of rule of thumb was if you're telling, it's generally okay. If you're asking, then you might want to be concerned. So if you're providing information, that's advocacy, that's information. If you're starting to ask for something, then you want to be a little more cautious. So that's a bit of the voice that I have in my head as we have these conversations. It's not always quite that simple, but Regina, thoughts from you?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of it this way until that question was asked, but in thinking about it, I realized I'm sort of two different people. So if I have hear of a student who's having an issue with registry, some state agency, that could well be, a call, and I would say, Joe or Mindy, or, and we would have this conversation. But if I'm reaching out regarding the state budget while they're debating the state budget, and I want to make sure that funding for public higher education in general and Greenfield Community College in particular is on the table, and I am asking something, which is I would like it to be at this number, not that number. We would like it to be. Then I'm much more formal. I'm sort of a very different person. I would write to Senator Comerford, and I would write to Representative Domb, and it's a little schizophrenic, but I never thought of it that way. Because I think in working as a state employee, Mindy was saying, we have a lot of rules, we have a lot of ethics rules that all of us are allowed, of things we can and cannot do, and gifts we can and cannot accept, which is all of them. And I think it's just easy to get into the headset of that, but I never really thought of it that way until just this second, that I realized I address them differently, I speak differently, I present differently, and I follow up differently. So I guess that's a response to having a cognizance of that and wanted to make sure that we don't cross that line.
And I certainly appreciate just being able to say when it's not clear, like there may be a line here and I'm not sure, but here's what's in my head, and stop me if this is crossing a line that I'm not aware should be a line. So, all right. So let me ask another question that came through on the discussion board. It had to do with the role of consortia in this relationship between legislative delegations and campuses. So pretty much everybody who's in the audience today is an employee with one of the consortia across the country. And our role is often to be a mediator, to be a facilitator, to get the right people in a room together. But the question has to do with, are there times or circumstances when consortia should step aside and not be in the middle of that conversation between campuses and legislators? Anybody?
My initial
We're always valuable.
my initial response is no. No, that your convening role was critical, because especially in this pandemic, when the days were long and the need and demand for intensive directed communication that could get us the information we needed to be able to serve better. The fact that we could get on a call together, and it wasn't 6 different calls, it was one. And I could feel like and then it wasn't just me, it was my colleagues, my House colleagues as well. And we could have a shared brain in a very well agendaed, and thank you to 5 colleges, moment. I think that was exceedingly valuable. It didn't prevent me from working with Regina at GCC on issues, or working with Chris Dunn, for example, at UMass, and Mindy on another, at Domb, on another set of issues. Didn't prevent any kind of deeper connection with any of the campuses as a follow-up, or as even a separate whole other parallel path. It was an additive only for me.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts from the consortium. One is, we sort of have a rule of thumb that if an issue or idea doesn't involve ideally 3 or more campuses, but certainly at least 2 campuses, then it's not our role to play, right? So if one campus has an issue or a concern, they're sort of on their own for that. Our role as a consortium is really when it gets to be multiple campuses all sharing a need or wanting to have a joint conversation. The other thing is, maybe we should describe, because we've all been in these 10 meetings in the last 8 months, but most of our audience has not been. So at least in our case, 5 colleges has not inserted itself as a substitute for the campuses. So the campuses have all been on those calls. So we're not speaking on behalf of the campuses or trying to represent the campuses. I think part of the role that we have played, particularly Kevin and I, who are generally on the calls, is because we're in conversations with all 5 campuses, it's easier for us to see the threads that are in common across all 5. So for the benefit of the attendees, what we have typically done in our meetings is, one of us will start out with an overview of, here's generally what we're hearing from across all 5 campuses. So have people made decisions yet about the next semester and whether students are coming back? What's the plan for testing? And here's the general plan across all of the campuses. But then we'll do a round robin and let the individual campuses weigh in and say, well, that's true for most of them, but we're doing something a little different, or provide some additional information. So we're really, I feel like we've tried very hard not to put ourselves in the role of representing the campuses, but really being that facilitator and convener. So I think that may be helpful.
I have to say, I think that the 5 College Consortium has been invaluable to all the legislators who participate. If I speak on behalf of just myself, though, these meetings and Kevin and your Sarah's facilitation of them and streamlining them and prioritizing topics and following up afterwards has given all the support that the discussions had needed so that they become more meaningful. It's not just an exchange of information. I was going to say, though, that the only thing I would warn a consortium not to do is get involved in the community versus the higher ed institutions. If there are clashes, I think that my advice would be to get into your bunker, for lack of a better word, and let the legislator and the communities deal with it, because I've been very aware of wanting to sort of protect the consortium from what's coming at the institutions. But I also want to point out something else that you did that you may want to share, which is when we thought we were having more colleges come back in the fall, you created a one-stop place with everybody's policies, protocols, and programs. And that became invaluable because that was sort of the representation of transparency. And our role in large extent was to make sure that the community felt they were getting information, and you were helping us achieve that. So I want to thank you publicly.
Thank you. Yeah, that absolutely came out of our experience, knowing how hard it is to keep track of what 5 different cats are doing at any given moment in time, and feeling that pain from members of the community and from our legislative delegation needing to have a one-stop shop instead of having to go to 5 different websites that are all laid out a little differently and so on.
Right. I just want to build on what Rep. Domb just
Yeah.
said. You know, when we first got in office, some House members and we had these things called legislative listenings, because we recognized the value of taking in information together at the same time from the same people focused on a particular issue, both to help our constituents try to figure out how the heck do you get all of us on the phone, and, you know, so help to streamline that constituent contact, but also because then we were on the same page with our constituents together as a block. And in Western Massachusetts, we say this all the time, right? We are stronger when we're together out here. There's just not enough of us, you know, given the population differential. And so we are better when we are linking arms on a specific issue for our people and focused together. And that's that you made that possible, but in reverse. We didn't, you know, convene a legislative listening, you convened us. And that was, you know, it was a perfect model of that working and that concept working, but in reverse with your leadership.
That's been our mantra within the consortium too, is that the campuses are better together than individually. So, and yeah, being in Western Mass, that makes a difference as well. Let me, there's a question that has come in that I'm going to get to in just a second. I wanted to ask about what advice you all would have for campuses that don't have an existing relationship with a state delegation, and in particular cases where campuses don't have a particular legislative liaison, somebody with expertise in this area that they can turn to. If somebody wanted to go about building this relationship, we also had the benefit with Rep. Domb that she was also new and so wanted to build that relationship. So you might speak a little bit about cases where the legislator has been around for a long time and may not feel that need to learn more about the community. So tips for folks just wading into these kind of relationships.
I think I want Regina to speak about this because after I got elected, the president of GCC and Regina invited me up to the college and gave me a tour and sort of like a small visit, but one that was designed to just inform me. And I think that was very valuable, and it was a first connection. So I'm going to give it to you, Regina.
Thank you. And it's funny that you said that inappropriate, because when Sarah was phrasing this question in my head, I was saying, just invite them over. And even, you know, even if the senator or the representative isn't new, if you're new to them and they are new to you, you know, you might both have been in your jobs for a long time, but if the relationship is new, then that's what it is. You know, it's like the welcome wagon, you know, and it serves it serves purposes on both sides. Clearly, we in Rep. Domb's case, we really wanted her to see our beautiful campus, and we also happened to have a new president at the same time she came in. So I was doing a lot of inviting for people for different set of reasons, but it's an opportunity for her to get to know us, but it's also an opportunity for us to get to know her. And that's a very comforting thing. It seems to be my word today on this snowy day, is to say comforting. But it's, you know, when somebody's newly elected, you don't know what you got. And the best way to find out is to meet them and have a conversation, and not a formal, you know, thing, you know, that people are all dressed up and and anxious and putting on a show, but a conversation and a tour and a coffee. And as you all know, you all have colleges, when you give tours, you meet students. And when you meet students who you stop and have sidebar conversations, and they get to understand this is your mission. These are our people and they're their people. And it's nobody can speak for the work of our college better than a student. I can't, the president can't, nobody can. It's the person whose life is being changed in that moment, and bringing them into it rather than telling them about it in a separate location has always just felt right. And I wouldn't stop.
I want
Excellent.
to echo that. I think
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear students being brought up here. One of our biggest jobs in higher education is ensuring that we're preparing our students to be engaged in civic life. And how better to do that than to introduce them to engaged civic leaders. In terms of creating the relationship, I don't think there is one thing that fits everyone. I think every college kind of plays these games with their higher ed administration about who's in charge of what, and everyone's going to find a different answer. What I would say is it shouldn't be one person in charge of interacting with the legislature. I think there could be one person who serves as that conduit. But I think the most effective relationships we've had have been where I've been able to connect anyone on the legislature to the person they most need to talk to. It's not like media relations where we may just be funneling through one person who is speaking on behalf of the institution. We want to encourage these person-to-person relationships. I've had folks in the legislature working directly with human resources to connect to employees who are having trouble filing for a state benefit or something like that, where we can provide that direct thing. But I also do think that needs to start at the top, that the chief executive of any institution should be meeting with their representatives in the legislature, and not because they need something and not because there's an agenda to the meeting. Just, it's that let's get together, and I'm just speaking of a different world here. Let's get together and have coffee and just start that conversation. Because again, I think all of this is about relationship building and organically finding the ways that are going to work best for each of your institutions. It's going to change for everyone. And I think trying to define it specifically as saying legislative affairs have to roll entirely through this one person in this one position gets away from the ability to have organic connection.
Can I also say something, Sam? You brought this up. I'm sorry, Senator Comerford, did I interrupt you?
No, you go and then I'll go.
That the other piece of this is that when you brought up students, the students are our constituents. So also connecting us to groups of students, whether it's in a classroom environment or in a discussion environment, is completely not only appropriate, but I actually feel it's necessary. We go to a lot of community meetings where we hear from people who live in our district all the time about the issues that are of concern to them. Students have to be part of those groups, because in my district, they're a significant chunk of my constituency, but I think in any district that has colleges, students are a constituency just as much as the organization, the faculty, and the staff. And so you also play a role in connecting us to them, whether it's on a tour and walking in a hallway, or bringing us into a classroom, or connecting us to a club that's interested in legislation, whatever it is. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Sam. Thank you.
I was also really happy that Sam mentioned that. I think the same way about students, absolutely. And I also think, and I'm sure Rep. Domb thinks this too, part of our job is to embolden and engage with the rising electorate. It's how our democracy, functions best, and they are the most hopeful embodiment of that. So I was actually gonna lean in on that as well, and I was gonna say two other things. One is, every single time I have a meeting, whether it's in a virtual coffee or an in-person experience, no matter how busy I am, no matter where I come back to my team and say, oh my God, that was the best. I can't believe how amazing they are. Or this is what they're struggling with, you guys. We have to take this on. There is no substitution for a one-on-one immersive, or a 3-on-1 or 5-on-1 immersive conversation to open the heart and mind of a legislator who, we're generalists, so we have a lot of inputs coming at us all the time, but get us focused on what you're talking about, what you need, what you're interested in, the opportunity you want to go for. That's amazing. And the last thing I'll say is, it's not just us. We each have staff. We have teams or in an individual with whom we work. And I would say, just for my team, Elena Cohen and Sam Hopper, who are here in the district and whose job it is to go deep on campuses or in communities or with constituent services, engaging with them deeply too as leaders of the Senate team makes also a whole lot of sense. Regina will tell you, the staff do an enormous amount of work. So the legislator might be responsible for voting or might be the public face, but really seeing an organic whole in a team is, I think, absolutely critical.
Excellent. So I'm keeping an eye on the clock. We've got a little bit less than 10 minutes to go. And I want to shift gears a little bit because several of you have talked about face-to-face visits and tours and students, and it speaks to a day when we might actually be able to do that sort of thing again. One of the things in the last few months that's been easier about getting our group together, because it's been 20 or 25 people on our phone calls. One of the things that's made that possible is the sense of urgency of a global pandemic. But what happens after the pandemic? What happens when that sense of urgency goes away and we still want to have communications, but it's harder to get 25 people to all agree that Monday afternoons at 3 is a good time to take some time out and talk about things that don't feel quite so critical. So I'd like to hear each of you in the 6 minutes we have left, just talk a little bit about how you see this relationship evolving or what benefits you see continuing after this crisis period in that blessed day when we can all go about our lives again. Let's see, Sam, can I invite you to start?
Yeah. I think one of the biggest barriers to some of these meetings is, and depending on what kind of institution you're in, this sounds silly, can be driving time. And if you're trying to coordinate the schedules of 25 people to meet in a neutral middle location, you're going to spend most of your time coordinating that. Versus, I think the benefit that Zoom has shown us, and I haven't used that phrase before, that sometimes there is an ease to these sorts of meetings that we didn't expect before. And you can always find half an hour if you don't have to put half an hour on each side of that just to get somewhere. And I know that's a very small piece of what we're talking about. But again, I think it goes back to, we shouldn't just have these meetings when we have something we know we have to talk about. It can just be a chance to sit around a common table and say, here's what we're dealing with. What are you hearing? And it's this sort of, I think everyone can come to the table and say, what can we do for everyone else at this table? And I think those might actually be more fruitful conversations because they're not just going to focus on things like quarantines and contact tracing and economic impact. It can just be, again, going back to that relationship building and finding out what comes up.
Thank you. Regina, can I call on you next?
Sure. Two things. One is that I think the benefit to the continuity of these meetings would make it worth, even when we can all come together physically, to maybe think about having a continued Zoom relationship in the interest of making sure it happens. So in any of the colleges that I would drive to, it's at least an hour drive time minimum there and back, round trip. So, knowing that we could have that option, and certainly not all of them because there's no substitute for human contact, but if it were a monthly meeting, just figure maybe every other one could be in person or something along those lines. But it just wouldn't have seemed possible before. And now that seems very possible. And the other point I was going to make, this was going to be an add-on to what Senator Comerford just said, and it is, but it also relates to this question that you just asked, Sarah, which is moving forward for us and for all of the people in this conference is, get to know the staffers, because there's your continuity. Having a regular, ongoing, easy relationship with staffers who don't have to be on the floor at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the morning and, can be more accessible. And it creates the built-in continuity that you need for that relationship. And they don't get to be staffers unless they're smart and good and know how to do their jobs and tend to be really fun, cool people. And so it's just, I can't underscore enough what the senator said, that's Joe, I'm sorry, Senator, you have you know, your original Jared has been with you from day one, her chief of staff, and you know, so they're in it for the long haul, and knowing that somebody has the backstory and what you're talking about, you don't have to, you know, bring them up to speed every other time you have a conversation. That really helps with the conversation, getting work done, and knowing that the continuity will be there.
Excellent. Thank you. Got just a couple minutes left. Rep Domb, Senator Comerford, either of you want to talk about what you see happening after the pandemic?
I'll jump in super quickly. I want these to continue. I like the ideas of alternating between Zoom and in person. I also want to say there's power in an agenda, a focused agenda. So for example, if the campuses, and I'll just include HCC here too, which was on the, you know, on these calls. So if the 7 campuses were interested in talking about a public health matter, or a particular barrier to entry in higher education, or a particular rule that's coming out from DHE, Department of Higher Education, that is affecting you, and you want a focused laser conversation, that's very compelling for me. If it's a, you know, if it's general catch up, I'd love to do that in person so that we can build those relationships or see your campuses. But if, you know, a powerful agenda, not unlike what you've been creating, that's been drawing us to it and to tackle this particular pandemic and economic crisis, will always compel us, I think, as elected officials to want to be with you. And because our job is to serve and to work for you. And if there's a problem to untangle, you know, you have us.
Thank you. Yeah, the pandemic has certainly given us focus as well as urgency. That's good to be reminded. Rep Domb, you get the last word.
I'm hoping they continue. I don't think they have to continue as frequently as they have. I could see it being like 2 to 3 times a year. But I have to say, I think the pandemic is also, and the impact of the pandemic on higher ed is going to be with us for a while. So, you know, hopefully the public health impact will go away, but I think the economic impact is going to be felt. And so I think we're still going to be needing to meet about the ways in which the pandemic has either shaped higher ed or affected it. But I hope we continue, because there's always going to be something to discuss. You know what your needs are in your sector. And as Senator said, you know, meetings could be directed on one particular issue at a time, but there's a way to formalize the ongoing part of the relationship that I think is really important.
Great. Thank you all, panelists, for joining us today. I know you're all very busy folks and appreciate your time. And thank you to the attendees for coming. If there are any questions that we did not get to that you have, feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we will do what we can to get back. But thank you all, and have a lovely, lovely afternoon.
Thank you.
Everyone.